Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Newswatch 16, Stacy Lange here, coming to you from the WNEP Digital Studio. This is the Action 16 Investigates Crypto live Q&A session. We thought this was a good way to wrap up the series that we've been working on all month. If you've seen our stories on Newswatch 16 and 11, we've explored all different areas of the world of cryptocurrency, and specifically how scientists and business people and average people, everyday people, are involved in the world of cryptocurrency right here in northeastern and central Pennsylvania. Now, we spent a lot of time on these stories. They were all about 3.5 minutes long, and we delved into a lot of different areas. But this world is so big that there's so many more things we could talk about. That's why we wanted to do this live Q&A session, so we can answer some of your questions. If you've seen the pieces and questions arose, or if you haven't and you're brand new to this world and maybe just a little curious, that's how we started doing this story. I saw advertisements on this during the Super Bowl about Bitcoin, and I was very curious about how this world worked. So we delved right in and found a lot of local people who are part of it. And that's, how we found our guest tonight. He was the subject of the most recent piece for Action 16 Investigates Crypto. I'd like to introduce Professor Hank Korth from Lehigh University, who is a professor of computer science and engineering, and also the director, I think is the proper term, of the blockchain lab at Lehigh University. So welcome, Professor Korth. Thank you for giving us your time and your knowledge tonight.
Oh, thank you, Stacy. Pleasure to be here tonight.
First, one thing that I kind of wanted to start off with, we talked about this when we first spoke more than a month ago, but it wasn't able to make it into the piece, is how did the blockchain lab, the blockchain programs at Lehigh get started? It was suggested to you by a student, right?
Yes, this was actually all a student initiative. This was happening at the end of 2017. This was an earlier Bitcoin boom, huge amount of student interest, and a number of students came to me and said, we ought to have a blockchain course at Lehigh. Well, I'll see if anybody is kind of set up to do that. I found that nobody was. I said, okay, I'll do it. So we ran a course set up as kind of an interdisciplinary course, some tech, some business, some applications, some policy. Had a great time doing it, found a really rich alum community among Lehigh graduates who were in the space. And this has blown up into 6 distinct courses, and beyond that, a huge amount of research going on, lots of interaction on the outside, external research funding, various relationships. So student initiative got the whole thing going.
Which is great, encouraging for you, I'm sure, as an educator.
Oh, absolutely. And
we're going to be taking questions from viewers throughout the broadcast tonight, but I wanted to start something off with a question I got on Facebook earlier today, because I think it kind of hits the nail on the head for how a lot of us are feeling about as we hear more about cryptocurrency in the news. And Lynn asks, do we have to worry about crypto replacing money as we know it?
No, the actual likely replacement is that the major central banks of the world that currently issue the fiat currencies we know, the dollar, the euro, the yen, etc., will move to having digital currencies that they issue, either in addition to or in replacement of the physical cash that we deal with today, which means it would be the same money, the US dollar and so forth, but just a different, more efficient, and probably more trustworthy means of interacting.
When we delved specifically into Bitcoin, and it's important to note, if you've seen the stories, you know this already, but if you haven't, there are thousands of different kinds of cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin's just the one we hear about the most, and it was the first, if I'm correct. One of the things that is thrown out about Bitcoin a lot is that it is recession proof, which is obviously something we're talking about a lot with the dollar these days. Is that do you believe that it is recession proof? And is that a problem that cryptocurrencies can solve?
Well, whether or not Bitcoin is truly recession proof remains to be seen. There have been times where Bitcoin does not move in tandem with other assets like stocks and bonds. Sometimes it has. And as more and more people are coming into the market, that's going to change the dynamics. But a key thing about Bitcoin in particular is that it has a deflationary monetary policy built into it. There is a maximum number of Bitcoin that will be issued. and that's it. And since some Bitcoin are lost because somebody loses a key or something, there would then be a slow decline. Well, if you look at the US dollar, the supply of dollars is always increasing. Depending upon how the Fed behaves, that rate of increase may be rapid or slow, but there's always some inflation. But of course, for any currency, it's how is it valued by the market at any given time? And that's not a property of crypto in general. That's how Bitcoin is set up. You could create a cryptocurrency with an inflationary monetary policy or lots of other things in between. And so I think the real point is that there's this huge flexibility in how you architect the environment.
Is there part of that is, and we've talked a lot about the psychology behind all of this, is part of that intimidating, the decentralization of it, the flexibility of it to us as a society that is so reliant on banks?
Well, I mean, on the face of it, maybe. But if we think about communication, I mean, okay, you can see from my gray hair, I'm old enough to remember when there was no internet and when making a phone call was an expensive proposition. Communication was very centrally managed. The internet now is totally decentralized. You take a computer, put it on the net, nobody controls that. You can ship out packets to whomever. And we're very comfortable with that whole decentralized environment. And in fact, it works incredibly well, especially in certain trying circumstances. And similarly, with many of the other things where we've relied on powerful intermediaries, moving to a more disintermediated, decentralized system gives you, for one thing, less central control, less single point of failure, and a central controlling authority also has the possibility of charging fees, imposing limits, and those things go away. So if you make the analogy, say, to the internet, becomes something that I think we can all be very comfortable with very quickly and very naturally.
Would you make that comparison that this change in technology is comparative to when the internet started?
It's the same type of change, and I think we're on a very similar curve.
Mm-hmm. Dan asked a question, if we could throw it up, because I think the story is super interesting if you don't know it. What led to the start of Bitcoin?
Okay, so all the ideas that went into Bitcoin go back actually decades. Some of them many decades into some deep mathematics of cryptography and so forth. And there have been many proposals for some kind of eCash that were better or worse or had a couple of issues. And so when Bitcoin happened, Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he, she, them, whatever is, we don't know who that creator really is, did an excellent engineering job of pulling together all kinds of technologies that were out there, making the right choices, the right parameter settings to get something that worked incredibly well at that moment. There's better solutions out there now, but that was remarkable for the time. But so it's hard to say really how long did it take to develop because so many things came from so long, but it was probably on the order of a year to do the final coding, patch it together and test it. Mm-hmm. I say probably, again, we don't know who did it, so I'm speculating.
I think that's super interesting. Steve made a comment, not really a question, but I think it's an interesting jumping off point. He says, everyone talks about Bitcoin now. Sorry, but you're 20 years too late. 20 years might be too broad, but I think what he's referring to is that the people who invested in Bitcoin very early on have made a lot of money from it. And that is not really the case anymore. But I think one of the most interesting things about what you're doing at Lehigh and what many people in Pennsylvania are involved in the space are doing is using the technology that powers Bitcoin for a multitude of applications. So can you talk a little bit about how, yes, there are some people who have become rich because they invested in Bitcoin the right time, but it's still, I think, very safe to say that blockchain technology is going to affect all of our lives at one point.
Right. They'll say a couple of things there. First of all, you weren't lucky enough to be mining Bitcoin in 2018 and hold it. But again, for the internet analogy, there have been all sorts of huge successes in that space, and not just at the beginning. So, don't be discouraged. There's a future ahead there. But what's really important is the technology. And in fact, Bitcoin, from a technology standpoint, is largely a laggard compared to several of the other leading blockchains. I won't get into the details of them here, I don't think, but the underlying technology makes it possible not just to decentralize money, but decentralize information, so that we could, for example, in a social network setting, own our own posts as opposed to giving them to Facebook or some other central provider, who then not only owns our posts and chooses who sees which ones when and then monetize them. So we could decentralize that control and ownership, which would be a fantastic change. Healthcare records could be managed in that way. So like you show up at the hospital with permission to access your health records, and the doctor just adds stuff to it, and on you go, creating truly accurate and global access to health information and improvement in healthcare. Many things like that, where this technology can change our day-to-day experience in really important things.
Do you think that there's been something culturally that's driven that, perhaps desire is the right word, for decentralization?
Yeah, some of it is that the technology has gotten to the point that we can do some pretty fantastic things that are really good for society. The original stuff, going back to the folks surrounding Satoshi Nakamoto, they've had a very strong libertarian political bent. They were very offended by all of the bank bailouts in the 2008 financial crisis. And in fact, the first block on the Bitcoin blockchain is a comment on that, where there is a reference in the memo section, Chancellor on brink of second bailout of banks, Chancellor referring to the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, no doubt. Maybe that's a hint as to who Satoshi is. I don't know, but there is very definitely a kind of independent, individualistic culture, very privacy oriented. But while that was the culture of the creation, the technology itself can go in many directions. And we've seen in China the technology being used not for decentralization, but for centralization. So like any technology, we have to be careful to use it for good and not for bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How important is it for you as an educator, for students and people like me to have a literacy when it comes to this technology?
Oh, critically important. And a huge case in point is a lot of the discussion you've seen coming out of Congress, but also out of regulatory agencies, where the people in charge know little or unfortunately nothing about the technology. Now, I want to be clear, there are some very well-informed individuals, and both the state of being well-informed and being poorly informed is bipartisan. There's folks on both sides. So not a political statement here, but if we're going to make wise decisions, it's really important that the decision makers at least know enough to be able to ask the right questions of experts. And we have so few of those now. And so I think one of the greatest things we're doing at Lehigh is all the students whom we are teaching with Lehigh blockchain through our courses, our projects, our research, and in our own, I guess, small but significant way, we're helping to alleviate that problem.
Let's talk a little bit about trust. It's something that we discussed in our interview preparing for the story that we did together. But so much of blockchain and cryptocurrency hinges on trust and who we trust in a traditional system and who we would trust in a crypto system.
Yes.
Can you just expand a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, if I'm giving a introduction to somebody who really knows nothing about this space is what's all this blockchain stuff about? That's where I start. I talk about the idea that, if I deposit money in a bank, okay, my money's gone, but I have a certain trust in the bank that it's going to do the right thing. And if something fouls up, well, I can go to the government and I trust the government. And so we have a lot of things based on trust in authority, trust in intermediaries. And then I get to this whole idea of disintermediation, where instead of trusting a single point of authority, we can trust a central truth that is managed by the crowd. And lots of things come from that. And a friend of mine who's also been a speaker in several of my classes has a book out now on that subject that is, I think, a really good book by the guy's name is Omid Malakan, and the book is the big word in there is trust in the title, and very readable, And so now from that central point, you then get to the whole idea of decentralization, and also in terms of deployment, that it's not absolute trust versus trustless, but trust is a knob. How much do we trust? Is it an individual, a group, a crowd, and trust with what? And all of those things are ultimately parameters of the technology, and the things that we have to decide as a society going forward.
We have another question from Dan. I think it's one that a lot of people are curious about. Is Bitcoin a better investment than the stock market?
Okay, Stacy, I'll politely choose not to answer that. I have been, given all the students I teach, I am extremely careful not to give investment advice, but rather to highlight technology, talk about where I see as the long-term trends and the idea that blockchain technology will change the world. But now, does that mean you should invest in Bitcoin, Ethereum, Polkadot, Polygon, Cardano? I mean, there are a whole bunch of major ones, and then comparing to the stock market, they don't necessarily move in lockstep. They move in different ways, and so my real answer to this one is that any kind of investment is a very important individual decision based on your risk profile, your time frame, your overall net worth, how much can you afford to lose, how patient can you be. And so, short story, you really need to talk to your personal investment advisor. Sorry, I can't.
No, that's fair. That's more than fair.
Choices,
I do think it is very important to note, and I just discovered this in my research, that there might be a chance that part of your 401k is invested in crypto. Walmart is investing its 401ks into crypto, so it's out there. And another reason why it's important to be educated about it, just as any place where you would put your money.
And there are many ways to be invested in crypto. It's not just buying Bitcoin. And there are thousands of cryptos you could buy. You could also invest, let's say, in building a Bitcoin mining facility. You featured that in a couple of your spots, and so that's another type of way of investing. And there's also the idea of not just buying crypto, but staking it in proof of stake consensus mechanisms and all kinds of very interesting ways of earning income on your crypto.
You mentioned mining. Let's go there if you don't mind. How,
Sure.
Very simply, if you can, how does mining work? When we're talking about trust in the group, we're talking about miners, right?
Yeah. So, in some of your pieces there, you showed the mining facilities for Bitcoin, huge arrays of computers burning tons of energy. And basically, it's many, many, many nodes around the world competing to solve a hard mathematical problem. Whoever gets it first gets to add the next block. So that's one way of distributing control globally and securing the currency. But it's not the only way. And when we talk a lot about Bitcoin and therefore a lot about mining and then about all the energy usage, Ethereum, the number 2 crypto, is moving away from this mechanism of mining or proof of work is the technical term, to something called proof of stake. And the estimated energy saving is something like 99.995% or something like that. Basically, the energy consumption goes away for all intents and purposes. And so, again, to, what to invest in, if you have qualms about climate change that keeps you away from Bitcoin, well, there are some very important leading cryptos that have much more climate-friendly approaches to consensus. And so if you want to bring that kind of, ethical approach to your choices, again, all up to you and your own risk profile. But, I would guess that over time, the amount of mining that goes on will go down as there's more and more of a transition either of cryptos themselves or in the main usage to those that are more energy friendly.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Steve that is beyond my realm, but Professor, you'll understand it, I think. There are some people who will run a bunch of GPUs on the blockchain, but you can also cloud mine now from old cell phones. I don't know what that means, Steve.
I love the question, but Steve, you'll excuse me. I'm going to back up a bit to be sure that I'm addressing the full audience here.
Yes, thank you.
So basically, when I mentioned the idea that in Bitcoin mining, you're competing and solving a hard mathematical problem. So if I come at it with some old cell phone, I compute very slowly. My chances of winning are non-zero, but pretty small. If I come at it with a very powerful computer, okay, it costs me more to buy it. It's going to use more energy, but my chances of winning are higher. And so if I'm really playing to win here, I'll try to throw the best technology at it. And one of those things is to use graphics processing units, which now show up in almost every computer, including more modern cell phones. And the acronym for that is GPU. And yes.
One question I've had about mining is, and maybe I'm looking at it too simply, but especially with Bitcoin, if there are only so many Bitcoins, eventually that industry will dry up, right?
Well, no.
Not necessarily.
Okay, so
explain to me how the money.
I have to go one level
going.
deeper into how do miners make money?
Yeah.
So if I succeed and I add a block, I make money in two ways. One is that right now there is a reward paid by the system minting new Bitcoin. That's the thing that's going down to zero. The other part of the reward is that users who submit Bitcoin transactions, so let's say, user A is paying user B. Well, actually, user A will pay B, but then perhaps add a partial amount paid to the miner of the block that transaction goes into. Now, why would you just donate to the miner? Well, that gives the miner an incentive to choose your transaction to put on the blockchain rather than somebody else's. And so when that system reward goes to zero, this is going to be the only way miners make money. And so if you don't, as a user of Bitcoin, pay the miner, your transaction will go nowhere. So there'll still be an economic ecosystem to keep all of this going.
One thing you and I have also talked a lot about is when is this all going to happen? When will I inevitably own cryptocurrency or have to understand the blockchain in the way I understand the internet now? And that's hard to predict. But what are some of the factors that coming from your world think maybe have sped it up recently? Sure.
First of all, Stacy, I've got to say you really know a good bit about blockchain at this point. I'm really impressed.
Thank you.
In terms of the pace, it's fairly easy to predict what the endpoint's going to be, but then saying when that endpoint will come is a lot more challenging. And for those of you that think back to e-commerce when that was just happening, people thought, oh, that's going to take a while. We all want to go to our physical stores and feel the products. E-commerce boomed at a rate that nobody imagined, even before COVID. Of course, COVID took it to a whole other dimension. So that went much faster than anybody expected. Going back a couple of decades, there's the concept of the paperless office, which I remember from the late 70s, early 80s. And that was going to be the thing. It happened. I mean, that's where we are now. But it took much, much longer than anybody imagined. And so I feel a whole lot more comfortable telling you what the endpoint is than I do tell you about the rate of the path. But I will say that in terms of digital currency, leading governments and even some non-leading governments are looking at this in a very strong way. Enterprises are increasingly using blockchain in their corporate database infrastructure. Anytime there is a relationship between multiple companies where the trust may be there, but it's only partial trust. And there are technologies especially appropriate for in-house corporate blockchain databases. Key player there is a thing called Hyperledger Fabric. I won't say more, just thought I'd throw the word out there. And, we are in fact, working with some of those organizations as well. So all of these things are happening in parallel.
We have some very educated viewers as well who are throwing out very sophisticated questions. And this is another one you'll understand, Professor, but I don't. What's your opinion on XRP and their place in the market if they become the first cryptocurrency with true regulatory clarity?
Okay.
Smiling.
Once again, Dave, I'm going to take a step back because I'm going to assume that not everybody is as astute here as you are, Dave. Well, I love the question. Okay, so XRP is a cryptocurrency. We said there are many of them, and it is used by a company called Ripple, and largely what their business is about is international currency exchange. So right now, if I want to convert, let's say dollars to euros, that goes through a process of various banking exchanges. The SWIFT system manages that. It is relatively slow, relatively fee intensive, and Ripple looks to provide that very quickly, very efficiently, low cost. Now, Ripple has gotten itself into quite a bit of controversy. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is arguing that Ripple's XRP crypto is indeed a security, and arguing that it passes the Howey test, which are the criteria by which the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, decides whether something is a security or not. And so they have brought a case against Ripple for issuing and selling an unregistered security. Ripple begs to differ. These debates are ongoing. But the higher level question, the thing I think Dave was getting to here, is that a big problem in this space is the regulatory uncertainty. There are also arguments that a crypto might be a commodity or money or property. And depending upon the answer you give to this question, different regulations apply. And so regulatory clarity is really the fundamental issue here. That if I want to be legal, well, with what set of laws do I comply? And to the extent that they are contradictory, you say, well, whatever I do, I'm going to be wrong, then you get a certain degree of carelessness. That's not a good thing, but an unfortunate consequence of this unclarity in regulation. Comes back to my earlier comment about education. As we get a more astute set of people moving on into government and business and leadership, I would hope for a much wiser overall policy in that regard.
We have another question from Dan who asks, can you talk about privacy implications of central bank digital currencies?
Oh, yes. This is one of our research projects. We happen
Great.
to be working with a digital currency startup. So I've had some quite extensive conversations in this space. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that China's approach to this is the digital currencies in a database. The government sees everything. They can tie it to social credit, so there's no privacy. However, you could architect a central bank digital currency with huge amounts of privacy protection. A very key technology in this space is something called zero-knowledge proofs. The math is truly scary. But basically what it does is it allows me to prove something to you without actually revealing the details. So that, for example, I could prove that all of the money I've gotten came from legitimate sources, but not tell you what those legitimate sources are. And employing that technology within the structure of a central bank digital currency would enable private transactions. But they say, oh, wait, but then can't we just fund terrorists and, do all kinds of other illicit things, sell drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And so then you have to worry about aggregations of these things and limiting that. This is the concept of programmable money that's part of a well-designed central bank digital currency. And then you combine that with the proofs of the origins of funds, and it is possible to create an environment that should be much more secure from bad behavior than the dollar is now, briefcase of cash or something like that. And the promise of privacy has the potential for being even stronger than it is now. If I want true privacy, I have to take out dollar bills and give them to you. If we have this kind of zero knowledge-based technology, I can pay digitally. I mean, we do a lot of our payment, credit card, phone, whatever. Well, we could do those things and have them private, but yet satisfy the governmental need for regulation. A lot of detail to work out. That's why it's a research project. But it's one of the things that I'm having a fantastic time working with my students and our various external partners. Fun stuff.
Do you think that there will ever be a time where we don't have cash at all?
Oh, definitely. I would be surprised if any of my students have a piece of paper currency in their wallets.
I rarely do.
and
Yeah.
and coins. What's that? The only coin I think I have in use now is a dime I use to open up my trackpad when I need to change the batteries.
A quarter to scratch off lottery tickets or something like that, right? Yeah. You need them every once in a while.
Those things will go digital too.
Well, it has.
Yeah.
Largely. Yeah.
But,
So talking about zero knowledge proofs, it got me thinking. We spoke to one of your students, Maxime, who is very much and working in this space now, about the potential that this has.
And I'll just toss in, Maxime is a local boy from the area. So
yeah, he's from
really
Upper
excited
Stocking.
about that.
Yeah, really cool. He was very interesting to speak to. Do you expect that one day you talked about medical records, so much of what makes us individuals is held by other people or authorities.
Yeah.
Do you expect that we'll have like something physical, like either a computer or a flash drive that contains so much of, our owned information?
Well, the exact technology, is a separate thing. Mm-hmm. The actual data could sit out in some server in the internet, but as long as it's appropriately encrypted, it's safe. The problem is who can decrypt it. And so the thing that I need to keep myself is the decryption key. And that would be the, let's say, device that I might carry. So if I'm, have some medical disaster, incapacitated, well, that could be used by a medical facility to access my records. But then that access itself would be added to the records so that anything that they do, would be there to be, reviewed in the future. And then that's all, re-encrypted and, kept private. So the real issue is what's encrypted and who has access to it, and less an issue of physically where the various data are stored.
That's interesting to think about how that will change the way people, keep their private.
To your earlier comment about, applications evolving and decentralization, there are systems out there that do what, let's say, Google Drive does or Amazon Web Services, that is cloud storage, but do it fully decentralized. You have a little bit of extra disk drive space, you offer it up and you get paid for it. And it's all done then by taking some user data, spreading it out, multiple copies to make sure it's not lost, keeping it encrypted. And the leading crypto that is working in this space is Filecoin. It's one example of many that are basically decentralizing that whole cloud service business. And so then nobody can turn off your access to your data.
One thing that I've thought a lot about during the pandemic, and I think we discussed this as well, is if our world is moving in this direction, will access to the internet eventually have to become a human right?
Rights are a very difficult thing to talk about for a whole bunch of reasons, and we're already seeing some issues around this. We see certain countries trying to control access to the internet, and so there's both is government going to try to keep people away from information? Then there's also the economic aspect of it, and more so, I think going back several years, there was a big issue of digital access being an issue of poor people not having access. Still the case, but in many ways things have changed. If you look globally, cell phones are ubiquitous. People who have basically nothing else will still have a rudimentary cell phone. And in some developing countries, cell phone minutes are the digital money. And so we are, moving to a point here where, the globe has access, and at least good enough access to do digital commerce. And so it's becoming a de facto human right. How governments will deal with this is going to be a very difficult challenge going forward.
Which has always been a challenge.
Yes, absolutely.
With any right, as you brought up. We have covered a lot of ground here, and we've had some very, very astute questions from our viewers, and we appreciate that. I kind of want to end, if we can, on a really broad note. For the average viewer who may have seen our stories and thought, how is this ever going to affect my life? What's your best advice? How do we best educate ourselves about this world, and how important is that? How much do we need to know going forward?
Okay. Well, first of all, since we are at the end, I'd like to thank you, Stacy, both for the pieces you put together on air and for this session. Also like to thank the listeners. Some fantastic questions. I'm thoroughly impressed. So first of all, thank you to all
Great
of that.
Questions.
And then, in terms of, information going forward, first, a word of caution. A lot of the general media does a very poor job in this space. I mean, there are things that I have read in some of the major outlets that are flat out wrong. And so, I'm even more pleased with how nicely WNEP has handled this in terms of accuracy and completeness. But not everybody's that way. So watch what you read. If you'd like to dig deeper, there are a number of good websites that offer news in the crypto space. I'm going to highlight one where the CEO happens to be an alumnus of Lehigh University, and that is Coindesk. It's like you think from the words COINDESK.com. There's a wealth of information there. They have very strong journalistic integrity practices, and that would be a great place just to start to learn. And there are some good books as well, but just if you have one go-to place that can be a great springboard for more stuff, I would suggest that.
And how cool that it is run by someone who was educated here in Pennsylvania. I think that's really neat.
Now, some years back, but still, and he
still
stays
a point of pride.
He shows up in my class, the one that I do that's on policy and so forth. He comes when we could with COVID in person. Just a great experience for our students.
Great. That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you for your time. You've been very giving of your time and your knowledge in preparing these stories and for talking to us and our viewers today. I really appreciate it. And for those of you out there still curious, because there's still so much to learn, you can find links to our stories at WNEP.com, as well as links to Professor Korth's website to explain the blockchain lab at Lehigh and several of the other players in the stories that we covered. You can find that all at WNEP.com. And continue to send us our questions. We will, delve into these topics as we get them. So if you have something that you think Newswatch 16 Investigate should look into, let us know.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
for more
Professor
on Lehigh, blockchain.cse.lehigh.edu.
Great. I'll make sure that's included on WNEP.com. Yeah, it'd be awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Bye.